young girl came up here and sang for the first time on this stage. And that little girl has grown into quite a young woman and quite a singer. This is Allie Watson, everybody.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Ooh, imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one.
That song reminds me that it's not just our thinking that gets us where we're going. It's our thinking with the engine of our feeling that really pushes things into being. And what we call that is our imagination. When both thinking and feeling are at work, when our emotions are getting behind our best ideas and pushing, that's our imagination. And it's one of the most powerful things we have to move things into being. Now, no matter what else you're doing, if you are alive, you are thinking and feeling, and therefore you are creating. What it is we think and feel strongly about is made manifest in our world. That's the basic tenet of our teaching. We've been talking about it, not just all month, but pretty much, well, for the past 10 years that I've been here anyway, 9 years, whatever. And I knew Dr. Bob, so I know he talked about it. So what I would like you to do is a thought experiment with me. You ready? Stop thinking. No? No? Rene Descartes was the one who said, I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. And actually, he walked into a bar and the bartender said, would you like some beer? And he said, I think not. And he went, poof. That second one might be an urban legend. I don't know. That I think, therefore I am is, yes, it is kind of tilted toward the thinking side. But it is absolutely one of the ways we know we exist. I was remembering early this morning that Winston Churchill, he wasn't the greatest of students. He did not believe in this thing called studying. And so he got to a Latin exam, and it was an essay question. And he couldn't read the question, much less write something intelligent about the answer. And so because he was who he was, he just wrote cogito ergo sum. And apparently that was the perfect answer. Your beingness is the perfect answer for any of life's tests. Your beingness. Your beingness decides what you think and how you feel. And that is what you will create the world from. It is your beingness that everything starts from. And your beingness is your divine beingness. Some of you have never heard those words before, but I ask you before you're like, she's cray-cray. Before you go there, go into meditation and decide if maybe there's a possibility it's true. And then apply the test my teacher taught me. Would I be more free if I believed this? If I believed this idea that the divine is within me, if I believed that, if I chose to live from that, would my life be better? Because you know we're making it all up anyway, right? If you look back on history, you will find that depending on who wrote the book, I went to school in the Deep South and then moved up to Long Island. Let me tell you, the Civil War was taught very differently in each of them. You know, the War of Northern Aggression versus the Civil War and the war to emancipate the slaves. For the people in the South, it was very much a different war because they were looking at different things. They were looking at their own livelihood, where the Northerners were looking at slavery bad. Two very different things, or at least that's what they believed. And the higher truth won out. The higher truth, which is that the divine plan is one of freedom, bondage is not God ordained. I quoted that last week. Freedom is a divine idea. It will win out over any human belief in limitation. So here's the thing. We talk about, the name of this title is Living Out Loud. This month has been all about creativity and advocating for freedom of thought. That has to start within you. Freedom of thought has to start within you. And so the first thing you have to be free to think about is who you are. Who are you? Who have you defined yourself as? I know a turning point in my life came when I decided to stop saying victim and say survivor. We've all survived something, right? And so rather than seeing myself as a victim, I know I was 18 years old, swimming in my boyfriend's pool, when I said, you know what? The first half of my life was pretty messed up. You know, I had a character-building childhood, whatever. The first half of my life was pretty messed up, but if the next part of my life is messed up, that's on me. That's on me. I decide. Some idiot told me I was an adult now. And I was responsible for my thinking and my being and my way of being in the world and the results from that. But if I wanted to continue being a victim, then that's what I was going to continue receiving from the world. And this was long before I found Science of Mind. This is what most people call common sense. I had a little bit of it at 18. Years later in ministerial school, yes, it took me that long, 20 years, I said, I've been defining myself as a survivor, which means that I have taken the worst thing that happened to me in my life and let it define me. Even as a survivor, I was being defined by somebody else's actions. And so I stopped calling myself a survivor. I'm just me now. I am who I am. Like it or lump it, this is it. And I am defined by the divinity within me. I offer that to you if you have been victimized in your lifetime. You might want to consider thinking of yourself as survivor. And then at least, even if you're still attached to what happened, it's through the lens of your own strength, as opposed to the bad thing that happened. And if you've been calling yourself a survivor for a while, I invite you to think about what else you are and decide which piece of you, what percentage of you is survivor, which one's mom or dad, what percentage of you is successful business person, amazing baker of cupcakes, whatever it is you do that brings you joy, make that a bigger percentage of your self-image. Just start with making it a bigger percentage. And eventually you get to the point where your history does not define you in the slightest. And this is good according to Ernest Holmes. He wrote in the Science of Mind textbook, never limit your view of life by any past experience. Any past experience. The possibility of life is inherent within the capacity to imagine what life is, backed by the power to produce this imagery or divine imagination. Let me read that again. Never limit your view of life by any past experience. The possibility of life is inherent within the capacity to imagine what life is. To imagine what life is, backed by divine imagination. He doesn't say recognize what life is. He doesn't say settle for life as it is. He says imagine, which means imagine whatever you want. You're making it all up anyway. The stuff you've already manifested, you made that up. The world as it is right now, we made it up. For some of us, writing our life story is a pleasure and a joy. For some of us, we look at our life story and think this was written by Stephen King. Or at least edited by him. If you're really, really, into that kind of thing, maybe it was H.P. Lovecraft, which is who Stephen King reads to be scared, according to him. According to Stephen King. Sorry, there were a lot of hymns in there, weren't there? I suppose there should be a lot of hymns in church. Yes, I went there too. Okay, and back to the talk. Stop playing. Actually, keep playing. So I want to tell you a story. And remember, it's your imagination and what you think this story is about that defines the story. Once upon a time, in 1885, a princess was born in Windsor Castle. Her name was Alice. She grew up as a princess within the royal family. She was the great-granddaughter of the great Victoria. She grew up amongst all this wealth. She grew up with a lot of privilege. And when she was 17, she met the love of her life. She met her Prince Charming, who was actually Prince Andrew, who was the son of the king of Greece. A year later, she married him. They went and lived in Athens amongst all of this beautiful history. She was beloved by the people, most of them. She had I want to say it's 3 or 4 beautiful daughters who she adored. And eventually she had the son that was the mark of success for a princess, because, you got to keep the line going. This was her life. She had an amazing connection with the divine. She had an amazing ability to be useful to people, which she cared about a lot. And throughout all of the drama and adventures of her life, at the end of her life, her son said, "Please come live with us." And she went back to Buckingham Palace and lived there for the last 2 years of her life, surrounded by family, until she died in 1969. And it was early in 1969, so I might be her reincarnation. I'm just saying, that occurred to me. Let me tell you a different story. Once upon a time, there was a girl named Alice who was a princess. She was congenitally deaf. She never learned how to sign. She learned how to read lips because her mother said no one was allowed to repeat themselves for her. And so she either got on board and figured it out, or she just had to kind of nod and smile a lot. Not sure if what people were laughing about was her or something else. She did get married at the age of 18. She had her children. And then there was a revolution in Greece. And she went down to the front lines and started a hospital. And according to her letters, she saw horrific things. She saw terrible, terrible wounds. But she was right down on the front lines. And when the front lines fell, and her husband was taken into custody and was at risk of being executed, she thought she was going to be left alone with these kids. And they were able to get smuggled out as refugees with not a penny to their names to Paris, where they had to live on family charity for the next several years. Living on charity stinks. Living on charity, being poor as a church mouse, having nothing of your own amidst relatives who are filthy rich, is not fun. And her relatives began to resent having her around, and her children, and her husband. Around that time, she began to say that she was having a deep and intimate relationship with Jesus and several of the saints, and they spoke to her. And this was an intimate relationship in the physical sense. Her husband disappeared to the south of France with his mistresses. She was taken into a psych ward. And her children, most of them were raised, but Philip had no place to go. And so his uncle, who was Lord Mountbatten, kind of took him under his wing to some degree. But her son was pretty much homeless. He got shipped off to a boarding school and never knew where he was going to spend the holidays. He'd get kind of passed around. As a matter of fact, one of the times that he was at one of the castles, he signed in as a guest with no permanent abode underneath where it said home address. She finally got out of this psych ward, which is what we call them now. They didn't know much about mental illness in these days. She was actually, Sigmund Freud and his daughter Anna were brought in as consultants on her case. And they recommended x-rays for the schizophrenia that they had diagnosed. When you don't know what to do, you throw everything at it. She eventually convinced them to let her go and went back and lived with her mother. Her mother, who had said no one's allowed to help her understand what's going on. She has to do it herself. One day while Philip was out, on a field trip type of things, the men in the white coats came and literally kidnapped her and locked her up in Switzerland. Her son came home and didn't know where his mom was. She escaped once or twice, once rather famously. She spent years in that locked ward saying that she was fine. She finally was released again and went back to Greece, where she had been happy. And then the Second World War happened, and she was in Nazi-occupied Greece. She had some family friends, or a family that were her friends, and as they were walking past her little apartment that she had set up for herself and her son, who never showed up, this family walked by and she said, "Get in here, I'll hide you." This family of Jews were hidden on the top floor of her apartment throughout the war. And she lived like next door or halfway down the block from the Gestapo. This woman had guts. I mean, I'm just sitting here going, whoo, you go, girl. And she would keep from being investigated by saying, "I'm sorry, I can't hear you, I'm deaf. I don't understand your question, what?" And then she would just keep doing it until they got annoyed and went away. Plus, she's a princess. Who's going to argue? Definitely not a Disney princess, huh? She, when that was over, founded a group that she called the Christian Sisters of Mary and Martha. I don't know what was going on in her head, but she stayed in that part of Athens and she fed the poor. She did the work of Christianity as it claims its work is. And she was beloved amongst the poor because she was one of them. She sold some of the last of her royal jewels in order to get that convent started, in order to take care of the poor. And she was forever trying to find other girls to come and be novices, which, back then, becoming a nun didn't sound like much fun. She was finally rounded up by her family, who were terribly embarrassed by her, and brought back to kind of wander Buckingham Palace for the last 2 years of her life with her long robes and her cigarettes. But she knew she was an embarrassment to the family. She'd been sent away several times. The son who she adored only got to see her for the last 2 years of her life. So is she a victim? Is she the princess? Is she this amazing woman who eventually, Philip, who is her son and is currently married to Elizabeth II, who is the queen, after she died, she was honored as a righteous among the nations, the highest Israeli honor to non-Jews who risked their life during the Holocaust. So who was she? Was she defined by her deafness and being the victim of a family that didn't know how to help her and didn't want anyone to know that there might be a genetic issue with the family? Was she a schizophrenic? Was she simply deeply spiritual? Who was she? I'd suggest to you she's whoever the heck she wants to be. She gets to decide. History might put meanings on her, but she gets to decide. A few days before she died, she wrote a letter to her son, who she had loved and absolutely adored and kept in her heart her whole life, in spite of being separated from him most of his life. And she signed it, "Your old mama." Actually, I think it was Mama at the time. But she said, "I will always be with you. If you ever need me, I am right there." And so I'd suggest to you, she mostly defined herself in relationship as a mom, not the princess, not the mother of somebody who's number 6 in line to some throne somewhere that might still be there. She defined herself through her love, through her willingness to be of service, through her steadfast love for her son. Was she a survivor or a victim? or whatever comes after survivor. I hear a lot of people these days talking about how awful it is out there. Nobody wants to work. The baby boomers ruined everything, or blah, 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 blah. The president, no matter which one he is, bless you, is what ruined the entire country. I'm like, man, the presidency isn't that powerful. We had to help at some point. The government, woo. What if we choose not to be victims? What if we stop saying they broke it and start saying, this is what we have, what can we do with it? You know, you might still have some royal jewels you can sell and be of use in the world and make beloved friends who just adore you for your work and who you are. If you can imagine something, you can speak who you are and what that is into being. Living out loud requires you to speak it. I would suggest to you, I would challenge you and invite you to speak your highest dreams rather than your worst fears. Because whether you speak the worst or the best, that's what's going to happen. And everybody else might be having like the same storyline, but a very different experience. I've lived a miraculous life. I've lived a very blessed life. I have tons and tons and tons of privilege. And part of that is because one year when I finally went away to college, and it was just over the summer, so it was a taste, I sat on the quad by myself early in the morning and I had a revelation. I deserve to be happy. One of the quotations I found for this week was from Ernest Holmes, that it had something to say about stop spending your time trying to die and start to live. And that's exactly what I did that morning. Because I'd been trying to die. It got bad. And then, in direct proportion, it got good. It got really good. And I'm only halfway there, so I can't wait to see what happens next. So many of us are turning 50 this year. I didn't realize that, but for some reason, everybody's turning 50 this year. It's like this collective jubilee. For those of you who think you've already done it, you can do it again. Just join the party. 50's a really good year. My invitation is to define yourself differently just for a week. Instead of defining yourself as victim or survivor, define yourself as freedom fighter, as voice of truth, as world builder. Define yourself from your power and your joy and the divine within you, whether you're here in front of me right now or on YouTube. Define yourself from the thing you are most proud of. Define yourself, and you don't have to tell anyone what it is, so you can't get called arrogant. Define yourself as someone who could, someone who might choose to. That thing you always said you couldn't do, not didn't want to do, but couldn't do. What if you were the person who did that just to prove it to yourself that yes, you could? How do we do that here? We go to prayer. And so